There exists a being seated on a throne beside the Almighty, carrying the divine name within himself, and the 66 books you read every Sunday refuse to pronounce him. The Hebrew tradition calls him METATRON. The Talmud trembles when it mentions him. Moses saw him on Sinai and remained alive. The 70 elders ate bread before him and returned breathing. Every time the sacred text says the angel of the Lord without giving a name, the ancient rabbis whispered the same word back: Metatron. Then something happened in the 3rd century that buried him. The Jewish sages realized that this figure was becoming far too dangerous to remain on the official pages. They erased the name. They did not erase the presence. Take the Bible that is on your shelf right now. Search from Genesis to Revelation. You will not find his name anywhere. 66 books, more than 30,000 verses. 0 mentions of Metatron. But open the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, page 38b. The name is there, written in ancient Hebrew, attributed to a being whom the rabbis described as second only to the Eternal. Open the Tractate Hagiga, page 15a. The name appears again, this time linked to a controversy that shook Judaism for centuries. Open the Targumim, the Aramaic paraphrases read in synagogues since before Christ was born. The name appears once more, identifying exactly who the angel of the Lord is who speaks with Abraham, who appears to Moses in the bush, who guides Israel through the wilderness. The Bible you read hides this name on purpose. It is not a translation failure. It is not a lost manuscript. It is a deliberate editorial decision made almost 2,000 years ago by sages who feared what this name could provoke in the minds of the faithful, and their fear had real biblical foundation. In Genesis 16, Hagar flees from Sarah into the wilderness. A being appears on the road. The text calls him the angel of the Lord. Hagar looks at this being and says a sentence that should have shattered the entire theology of the time. You are the God who sees me. She saw an angel, but she called the angel God, and the sacred text does not correct her. In Genesis 22, Abraham stands with the knife raised over Isaac. The angel of the Lord calls to him from heaven, and immediately says, Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. From me. The angel speaks as if he were God in the first person. In Exodus 3, Moses approaches the burning bush. The text says that the angel of the Lord appeared in a flame of fire. But 3 verses later, it is the Lord himself who speaks from within the bush. The same scene, the same being, 2 different names alternating as if they were the same reality. The ancient rabbinic tradition recognized the pattern long before the New Testament existed. This angel of the Lord was not just any messenger. It was a manifestation that carried full divine authority, spoke as God, received worship that only God could receive, and yet was distinct from the Father who sent him. The sages needed to give a name to this figure, and the name they chose was Metatron. The word is not originally Hebrew. Linguists debate whether it comes from the Greek metathronos, the one who is after the throne, or from the Latin metator, the one who measures and marks out paths. The rabbis preferred the first interpretation, the being whose place is after the throne, or beside it. The Jewish mystical literature called Merkabah, which studies the vision of Ezekiel's heavenly chariot, dedicates entire pages to this name. The Sefer Hekhalot, known as Third Enoch, describes Metatron with 70 different names, each one reflecting a facet of the divine name. 70 names. 70. The same number as the elders who ate before God in Exodus 24. It is not a numerical coincidence. It is ancient theological code. And here is the detail that changes everything. When the Christian translators of the Septuagint in the 3rd century before Christ translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, they encountered this problem. How do you translate angel of the Lord without revealing who he really was? They left the expression generic, without a proper name, without clear identification. The Bible you read today in Portuguese, in English, in any modern language inherited that decision. The name was left out. The presence remained on every page. Every time you read the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, you are reading about him. Every time a celestial being speaks with divine authority without being explicitly named as Yahweh, it is him. Every time a patriarch falls prostrate before a messenger and the messenger does not rebuke him as ordinary angels do in Revelation, it is him. How many times? The rabbinic counters found more than 50 appearances, 50 times this being walked through the pages of the scriptures without you knowing his name. 50 times you read about METATRON without knowing you were reading about him. And now the question that will hammer until the final chapter. If he was so important that he appeared in dozens of decisive moments of biblical history, why did the sages who organized the canon decide to erase his name? Exodus chapter 23 verse 20. Moses is on Sinai. The cloud covers the mountain. The Eternal speaks a sentence that modern translators rush past too quickly for you to feel its weight. Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way. It sounds common. It sounds like any other celestial messenger. The next verse dismantles that impression. Take heed before him and obey his voice, and do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. My name is in him. In Hebrew, Shemi Bekirbo. Literal translation, my name within him, in his inner being, at the center of his existence. No other celestial messenger in the scriptures receives this attribution. Gabriel does not receive it. Michael does not receive it. The seraphim of Isaiah and the cherubim of Ezekiel do not receive it either. Only this unnamed being carries the tetragrammaton within himself, and the Eternal adds a clause that should chill the spine of any attentive reader. This being will not forgive transgressions. The ability to forgive sin is the exclusive prerogative of the Creator according to all biblical theology. Christ himself in the Gospels provokes scandal precisely by claiming this power. But in Exodus, centuries earlier, the Father had already delegated this power to a figure who is not named. The rabbis of the Talmudic period fought exegetical battles around this verse. How can a celestial servant possess the divine name and yet still be treated as distinct from the Eternal himself? The solution came through an ancient technique called gematria. Each letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a numerical value. Aleph is 1, Beth is 2, Gimel is 3, and so on. When you add the values of the letters of a word, you find a number. Words with the same number, according to rabbinic tradition, share spiritual essence. The name Metatron, written in Hebrew, Mem Teth Tet Resh Vav Nun, sums exactly to 314. The name Shaddai, written in Hebrew, Shin Daleth Yod, also sums to 314. Shaddai is one of the personal names of the Eternal in the Old Testament. It appears 48 times in the scriptures. It is the name by which God revealed himself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, according to Exodus 6, verse 3. It is the name used throughout almost the entire book of Job. Shaddai and Metatron share the exact same numerical value. For the ancient rabbinic mind, this was not mathematical coincidence. It was confirmation that the being of Exodus 23 literally carried the divine name within himself, and that this figure was the same one known in mystical literature as Metatron. The passage gains even greater depth when you cross it with the Targum Onkelos. the official Aramaic translation of the Pentateuch used in synagogues since before the Christian era. In Exodus 23, the Targum replaces angel with memra in some parallel traditions, an Aramaic word that means word or logos, the word of the Lord with the name of the Lord within it. Any Christian reader familiar with the Gospel of John feels the ground tremble here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John was drawing from a tradition that already existed centuries before he wrote a single line. Let us return to Exodus. The chapter continues. Verse 22. If the Israelites obey the voice of this being, the Eternal will be an enemy to their enemies and an adversary to their adversaries. Obedience to the messenger is treated as direct obedience to the Creator. Rebellion against him is treated as rebellion against the heavenly throne. No ordinary servant receives this status. Only someone who acts in his own name while carrying the supreme name. And there is a linguistic detail that escapes all modern translations. The expression "do not rebel" in verse 21 is the Hebrew verb marah, the same verb used when the people rebel against Yahweh himself in Numbers 20. Rebellion against this figure receives the same legal weight as rebellion against the Heavenly Father. The Jewish sages reached an inescapable conclusion. This being was not an ordinary servant. He was the visible manifestation of the invisible, authorized to speak and judge with full authority. The most uncomfortable point of the chapter appears now. This manifestation had form, had presence, had an audible voice. He was visible, but the Eternal had explicitly said in another passage that no one could see him and continue breathing. How do you reconcile these two statements without destroying the coherence of the Scriptures? The answer of the rabbis would open one of the most disturbing discussions in the entire Hebrew tradition, a discussion that involves a banquet on top of a mountain, 70 elders looking at something no one should have seen, and a deliberate editorial silence about what exactly they beheld that day. And what they saw that day opens the only window the Bible offers to the face of the one who carries the name. Exodus chapter 33, verse 20. The Eternal speaks to Moses with a sentence that seemed to close the matter forever. You cannot see my face, for no man shall see my face and live. Definitive, categorical, without loopholes. And yet 9 chapters earlier, the same book of Exodus records something that should be logically impossible. Exodus chapter 24, verse 9. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, verse 10. And they saw the God of Israel, verse 11. And he did not lay his hand upon the chosen ones of the children of Israel, but they saw God, and they ate and drank. 74 men. They looked upon the God of Israel. They ate bread before him. They drank in his presence. And they came down the mountain alive. The contradiction is so blatant that rabbis, early church fathers, and medieval theologians wrestled for 2,000 years trying to harmonize these two passages. 3 options were on the table. First option, the text contradicts itself and the editors did not notice. An unacceptable solution for any tradition that considers the Scriptures inspired. Second option, the elders saw only a symbolic representation and not God himself. A solution that collides with the crystal clear Hebrew of the verse. The verb ra'ah used there is the same as in any real and literal seeing. Third option, they saw the Eternal, but they did not see the inaccessible Father. They saw the manifestation the Father uses when he must be seen. The Jewish sages called this manifestation the Shekinah. The word Shekinah does not appear in the Hebrew Old Testament itself. It was coined by the rabbis from the root shakan, which means to dwell, to reside, to make one's abode. Every time the sacred text says that the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle, or that the cloud descended upon the mountain, or that the fire appeared above the ark, the rabbis identified the Shekinah acting there, the presence of the invisible made visible. The puzzle begins to close precisely at this point. Jewish mystical literature, especially the Sefer Hekalot and the texts of the Merkabah school, explicitly identifies the Shekinah with Metatron in several passages, as functions of the same being. Metatron is the form the Eternal assumes when he must be looked upon by human eyes without destroying those eyes. The banquet in Exodus 24 takes on a new meaning. The 74 men did not see the Father in his absolute essence. They saw his visible manifestation. They saw the one who carries the divine name within himself. They saw the being Exodus 23 had just described 3 chapters earlier. The rabbis had no doubt about this. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, when translating Exodus 24, makes a significant theological adjustment. Instead of saying that the elders saw the God of Israel, the Targum says they saw the glory of the God of Israel. In other versions, the word yekara, which means manifested splendor. They were not changing the meaning. They were preserving coherence. The elders saw the splendor that can be seen and not the hidden Father who kills whoever beholds him directly. There is an even more disturbing detail in this passage. The text describes what was beneath the feet of the one they saw, like a work of sapphire stone and like the heavens in their clarity. Feet. The being had feet. He occupied physical space. He stepped upon something that resembled a platform of transparent blue sapphire. Compare this with Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 26. The prophet describes the heavenly throne and says that above the throne there was a likeness with the appearance of a man. The same figure. Feet standing upon sapphire. Human form seated upon the throne. The resemblance is exact, and the rabbis perceived it. The one seated in Ezekiel is the same one who stands upon sapphire in Exodus. And the one who stands upon sapphire in Exodus is the one who carries the name of the Eternal in Exodus 23. And the one who carries the name is Metatron according to the whole Hebrew mystical tradition. The vision converges, but the theological problem deepens instead of being solved. If the elders saw a being with human form, with feet, with measurable presence, and this being was the manifestation of the Eternal, then the Eternal already had human form before the incarnation recorded in the Gospels. The early Christian tradition seized this clue with force. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century argued that every theophany of the Old Testament, every visible appearance of God to the patriarchs, was in reality the pre-incarnate manifestation of the Word. The same figure the Jews called Metatron, the first Christians identified as Christ before Bethlehem. This is not popular theology. It is an argument documented in manuscripts from the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Christian era. And the point that unites the two traditions is exactly this banquet on the mountain. 74 men beholding the visible form of the invisible, eating bread before the one who governs the universe, coming down alive to tell the story. The text closes with a sentence that sends a shiver. And he did not lay his hand upon the chosen ones. The hand could have been laid upon them. The privilege of living was granted by choice and not by right. They received the grace of seeing what no one can see because they saw through the mediator authorized to make visible what normally destroys. This mediator walks through the scriptures with defined form. Feet upon sapphire. Throne beside the supreme throne, divine name within him. And the next question that hammers rabbinic tradition is perhaps the most scandalous of all. Who, originally, is this being who can be seen without killing the one who sees him? The answer hides one of the oldest and most censored stories in Hebrew literature. A story about a man who walked with God on earth and never came back. Genesis chapter 5, the most monotonous genealogy in the Bible. Adam begot Seth, Seth begot Enosh, Enosh begot Kenan. Generation after generation, age after age, all end with the same clinical sentence. And he died, and he died, and he died, until verse 24. And Enoch walked with God, and he was no more, for God took him. Enoch did not die. The text does not say he expired. It does not say he was buried. There is no tomb, no family lament, no record of death. He simply vanished while walking with the Eternal. The canonical Bible leaves the account exactly like that. 5 lines, an interrupted genealogy, and silence. The ancient Hebrew tradition did not accept that silence. The rabbis knew something enormous had happened in that instant. A human being had been taken alive from the earth by the Creator. Where was he taken? And what happened after he arrived there? The answer came through a book called Sefer Hekalot, in Portuguese, Book of the Palaces. Modern scholars call it Third Enoch. It was compiled between the 3rd and 5th centuries of the Christian era, but it preserves Jewish oral traditions far older, possibly earlier than Christ himself. And here it is necessary to pause so that the honest ear knows exactly what it is about to hear. What comes next is not in the Bible. It is in the Sefer Hekalot, an extra-canonical Jewish mystical book. It is the way the ancient rabbinic tradition chose to fill the silence that Genesis 5 left open. It is not inspired word. It is the interpretive memory of a people who refused to let Enoch disappear without explanation. And what this book describes is one of the most disturbing narratives in all world religious literature. Enoch arrives at the heavenly throne, the Eternal receives him, and a transformation begins. Enoch's skin is exchanged for flames, his bones become embers, his eyes turn into torches, his eyelashes into lightning, his hair into dancing fire, his body expands until it reaches the width of the whole world and the height of the whole world. 72 wings sprout from him, each pair able to cover entire continents. 365,000 eyes open in his transfigured form, and each eye simultaneously beholds all creation. And then the Eternal proclaims a new name over him. I call you Metatron, my servant. This is the literal account of the Sefer Hekalot, from chapter 9 to chapter 13. An ordinary man, descendant of Seth, transformed into one of the most powerful creatures in the heavenly universe. The text continues. The Eternal goes on granting Metatron honors that no other being ever received in Jewish tradition. 70 divine names are engraved upon his crown. Each name corresponds to one aspect of the ineffable name of the Father. Whoever invokes any one of these 70 names invokes the Eternal through Metatron. A throne is built beside the supreme throne, not above, not below, beside, and the Eternal calls Metatron by the name that would make the prophets tremble, Yahweh Hakatan. In literal English, the lesser Yahweh, the smaller Yahweh. The title is written that way in Sefer Hekalot chapter 12 in clear letters. The rabbis of the Merkabah school taught this name for centuries. Yahweh Hakatan, the divine name applied to a being who was originally a human patriarch of the 7th generation after Adam. The Hebrew tradition did something that sounds impossible to modern Christian ears. It allowed a man to become a visible extension of the Eternal. And there are parallels in the Old Testament itself that sustain this reading. In Hebrews chapter 11 verse 5, the New Testament confirms that Enoch was translated so that he would not see death. The Greek word used is metatithemi, which means transferred, transposed, removed to another place of existence. He did not die, he was transferred. Jewish tradition simply went further by specifying where he went and what happened afterward. Daniel chapter 7 verse 13 offers a scene that fits perfectly with this transformation. The prophet sees one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven and approaching the Ancient of Days. This Son of Man receives dominion, glory, and kingdom. All the peoples of the earth serve him. Son of Man, human form approaching the throne, receiving authority that only the Eternal could grant. Medieval Jewish commentators repeatedly identified this figure with Metatron. Christian commentators identified the same figure with the Messiah. Both looked at the same verse and arrived at parallel readings that overlap at critical points. Son of Man elevated into the divine sphere, human form seated upon a heavenly throne, total authority delegated by the one who cannot be seen. The rabbinic mystical tradition developed the doctrine of Enoch Metatron in increasingly dense layers during the centuries that preceded the Christian era. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran in the 20th century revealed fragments of Enochic literature that circulated among the Essenes at the exact time when Christ was born. The figure of the patriarch elevated to angelic status was not an obscure niche. It was a doctrine widely discussed in the Judaism of the Second Temple period, and here arises the most serious theological problem of this doctrine. If a human being can be elevated to this level of heavenly authority, receiving the divine name and a throne beside the supreme throne, what does this mean for the hierarchy of the eternal beings who were in heaven before creation? Michael has been archangel since before the foundation of the world. Gabriel has delivered divine messages for immeasurable ages. The seraphim of Isaiah have existed since the dawn of creation. All these heavenly beings were created before Adam breathed the first breath. But Enoch, transformed into Metatron, surpassed all of them in position and authority. What kind of heavenly hierarchy allows the last to arrive to sit above those who were there from the beginning? The answer to that question shook the rabbinic courts for more than a millennium, and exposes a title that places Metatron in a category isolated from everything that exists between heaven and earth. The heavenly hierarchy has strict rules in Hebrew tradition. Each angelic being has a defined position, a specific function, a delimited territory of action. Michael commands the heavenly armies. His name means who is like God, and he appears in Daniel chapter 10, verse 13, fighting against the spiritual prince of Persia. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 7, he leads the war against the dragon. Gabriel transmits revelations. His name means strength of the eternal. It was he who explained the visions to Daniel, announced the birth of John the Baptist to Zechariah, and brought to Mary the news that would change human history. Above these two, tradition recognizes other archangels with elevated offices. All serve before the throne. All execute direct orders from the eternal at decisive moments in history. And all of them stand. This detail seems insignificant, but it is the exact point where Metatron separates himself from the entire known angelic hierarchy. Angels do not sit before the throne. They remain standing as servants awaiting orders. This is the posture of the heavenly servant throughout all Jewish mystical literature. Only one being has permission to sit. Sefer Hekalot. Chapter 10 records the title with precision. Sar HaPanim, the Prince of the Face, the Minister of the Presence. In Hebrew, panim means face, but it also means presence. To stand before the face of the Eternal is to remain continually in his direct presence, without mediation, without veil, without filter. No other heavenly being received this permanent access. Michael approaches the throne at specific moments. Gabriel is sent on defined missions. Raphael executes assigned tasks. All return to their positions after fulfilling the orders. Metatron remains, always, without interruption. Isaiah chapter 63 verse 9 offers the biblical confirmation that the rabbis identified as the key to this doctrine. In all their affliction he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. The angel of the presence. In Hebrew, Malach Panav, literally the angel of the face of the eternal. It is the specific being who dwells continually before the divine face. The same figure the Sefer Hekalot identifies as Metatron, and the verse of Isaiah adds a detail that changes the understanding of salvation in the Old Testament. It was this angel, the Prince of the Face, who saved Israel in all the afflictions of the Exodus, of the wilderness, of the battles. It was not Michael. It was not Gabriel. It was Metatron, the rescue operation of Israel through the Red Sea, the pillar of fire during 40 years in the wilderness, the victory at Jericho when the walls fell. Each of these interventions, according to the ancient rabbinic tradition, passed through the hands of the Prince of the Face. The Talmud in Tractat Sanhedrin, page 38b, records a fundamental debate about this authority. Rabbi Naaman argues with a skeptic about the existence of a heavenly being intermediate between the eternal and humanity. The skeptic argues that such a being would imply two divine powers. Rabbi Naaman responds by citing exactly Exodus chapter 23, verse 21, about the being who carries the name of the Eternal. The rabbinic answer is clear. This being is not a parallel God. He is the authorized instrument of the one deity, but even so, he occupies a position that no other inhabitant of heaven can claim. The Merkabah mystical literature develops this hierarchy in detailed layers. There are 10 angelic orders in heaven according to this tradition: cherubim, seraphim, ophanim, hayot, eralim, tarshishim, hashmalim, bene Elohim, ishim, and malachim. Each order has thousands of members, each member with his specific function. Metatron is above all these orders. He does not belong to any conventional angelic category. He is not a cherub. He is not a seraph. He is not an archangel in the traditional sense. He is a category with a single member, Sar Hapanim, the only Prince of the Face who exists in the entire heavenly structure. And there is a detail that makes this position even more disturbing. The crown Metatron wears, according to Sefer Hekalot chapter 13, was placed upon his head by the very hands of the Eternal. Ordinary angels have no crown. Archangels have insignia of command. Only Metatron was personally crowned by the Heavenly Father. And what this crown carries is so immense that it must be described carefully. Before revealing exactly what is engraved upon it and why the other inhabitants of heaven must step back when it is displayed, I will take a quick pause here with you. If this content has blessed your life, leave your like, comment below, and share it with someone who needs to hear these hidden truths of the scriptures. Subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you do not miss the next videos. And if you want to bless the channel in return, click the Super Thanks button and leave an offering of any amount or become a member. I also left some selected products in the description. Purchase one and strengthen this work that is revealing what remained hidden for 2,000 years. Now prepare yourself, because what comes next completely changes the understanding of what a heavenly crown is. The crown weighs 500 years of travel in diameter according to the mystical description. Each of the 65 letters of the complete divine name is engraved upon it. Each letter emits its own radiance. The crown radiates so much splendor that the other heavenly inhabitants must step back when it is displayed in its fullness. Nothing in Hebrew angelic literature compares to this description. Not even the seraphim of Isaiah chapter 6, who cover their faces with their wings before the glory of the throne, receive ornamentation of this magnitude. The tension that defines the rest of this investigation appears precisely at this point, when a human being transformed into a heavenly entity is elevated to a position that surpasses all primordial archangels, receives a crown placed by the hands of the Eternal himself, occupies a place adjacent to the supreme throne, and is called by the divine name in diminutive form. What is the boundary that separates this being from the Heavenly Father himself? The ancient rabbis perceived the danger of this question early. They tried to contain it with theological arguments and dogmatic definitions. They insisted that Metatron was creature, never creator, servant, never sovereign, functionary, never absolute authority. But there was a function delegated to him that put everything at risk. A function that only the Eternal should exercise according to all classical Hebrew theology. This function involved a book of infinite pages, a book where every act of every human being who has ever existed, who exists, or who will one day exist is engraved for eternal judgment. And the authorized scribe who writes in this book was not the Father. It was Metatron. There is a book in heaven. It is a literal object mentioned in at least 11 different passages of the Old Testament and 9 passages of the New Testament. Exodus chapter 32, verse 32. Moses has just come down from Sinai. He found the people dancing around the golden calf. He went back up the mountain to intercede for the transgressors. And he pronounces one of the boldest sentences a human being has ever addressed to the Eternal. Now therefore forgive their sin, but if not, blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book which thou hast written. Written. Verb in the past tense. The book already existed before this moment. It already had names recorded. It was already operational long before Moses was born. And Moses knew of the existence of this book. He did not need the Eternal to explain what he was asking for. The awareness of this heavenly record was embedded in Israel's spiritual culture from ancient times. The divine answer comes in the following verse. The Eternal declares that the one who sins against him will be blotted out of the book. He confirms its existence. He confirms the operation of recording and exclusion. He confirms absolute authority over who remains and who is erased. But Hebrew mystical literature adds a detail that the canonical text leaves in silence. The scribe who holds the heavenly pen is not the Father. It is Metatron. Sefer Hechalot chapter 17 describes the function in detail. Metatron keeps the records of the destiny of every living creature, every word spoken by every mouth, every thought generated by every mind, every act performed by every hand. Everything is recorded, everything is archived, everything is catalogued for the day of final judgment. Rabbinic tradition calls this document the Sefer HaChem, in English, the Book of Life, and Metatron's official title in this function is Sofer HaShamayim, the Scribe of Heaven. There is no other authorized scribe. There is no divided department. There is no team of heavenly assistants. Only one being performs this task in the entire known universe. And this figure was originally a human patriarch of the 7th generation after Adam. Daniel chapter 7 verse 10 offers the grandest vision of this record in operation. The prophet sees a river of fire flowing out before the throne, thousands upon thousands serving, millions upon millions standing before the presence, and the judgment sitting while the books are opened. The books, plural. Daniel saw multiple volumes being opened simultaneously before the Ancient of Days, each volume containing specific records of eras, generations, individuals, decisions. And who kept these books before they were publicly opened in that heavenly court? The mystical tradition answers without hesitation. The Scribe of Heaven. Revelation chapter 20 verse 12 repeats the scene with almost identical vocabulary. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by the things that were written in the books, according to their works. John, writing in exile on Patmos, describes exactly the same operation Daniel saw 600 years earlier. Multiple books, a special book called the Book of Life. judgment based on records meticulously written throughout human history. The consistency between the Jewish prophet and the Christian apostle regarding the existence of this heavenly archive is absolute. No divergence, no contradiction, only cross-confirmation of the same system. And the Enochic literature offers the most detailed description of this work. In 1 Enoch chapter 89, the elevated patriarch sees heavenly shepherds appointed to watch over Israel. Each shepherd keeps his own records, but all records ascend to a central archive under the custody of the scribe of heaven. There is a theological implication in this structure that shakes the simplistic view of the relationship between humanity and heaven. When the modern Christian prays asking for forgiveness, when the Jew observes Yom Kippur with fasting and repentance, when the ancient sinner brought an offering to the tabernacle, the record of each of these acts was processed by the same scribe. There is no randomness. There is no administrative forgetfulness. There is no data loss in the heavenly archive. Every spiritual action that has happened since Adam is catalogued with millimetric precision. Psalm 139 verse 16 offers another confirmation of this reality. The psalmist declares that the eyes of the Eternal saw his unformed body, and that in the divine book all his members were written before they even existed. The psalmist speaks of a book that contained the record of his body before the complete formation of the fetus in the maternal womb. This is the depth of the archive. The record reaches the biological structure of every human being before birth. The rabbis of the Merkabah tradition extracted from this verse a specific doctrine. The Book of Life is not only a retroactive record, it is also a predictive record. METATRON records what will happen based on the eternal decisions made in the heavenly council before the foundation of the world. And a legal ambiguity arises that the Jewish sages debated for centuries. If the scribe of heaven has authority to record and erase names, and if the Eternal in Exodus 32 confirmed that only he himself blots out the one who sins, what is the relationship between these two authorities? The Father writes. METATRON writes. The Father erases. METATRON records the exclusion. Where does the function of the scribe end, and where does the sovereignty of the throne begin? This question generated a controversy that divided Judaism in the 2nd century of the Christian era. A renowned rabbi had a vision that changed everything. He ascended to heaven in mystical ecstasy. He looked toward the throne and saw METATRON seated. What happened in that instant of revelation created the most explosive heresy in the history of Judaism and forced the sages to respond with a cosmic punishment that no other heavenly figure had ever suffered. Elisha ben Abuya was one of the greatest rabbis of the 2nd century of the Christian era, teacher of Rabbi Meir, a scholar of the Torah from childhood, a member of the highest circle of the Jewish intellectual elite of his time. He had everything: knowledge, prestige, full rabbinic authority. And he lost everything in a single vision. The Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Hagigah, page 15a, records the episode with details that sent chills through generations of scholars. Elisha entered a contemplative, mystical state. He ascended through the 7 heavens of the Merkabah tradition. He crossed the heavenly palaces. He reached the hall of the throne, and he saw something no one should have seen. METATRON was seated in heaven, before the glory of the Eternal. For Elisha, that image destroyed all the theology he had studied for decades. Rabbinic doctrine was inflexible on this point. In heaven there are no chairs. In heaven there is no rest. In heaven there are no seats. The angels serve standing because the act of sitting implies one's own authority, and no servant possesses authority of his own before the sovereign. Only the Eternal is seated. Only he rules from a throne. This was the absolute rule of Hebrew angelology. But Elisha saw Metatron seated on a second throne. His conclusion was immediate and devastating. If there are two beings seated in heaven, there are two authorities. If there are two authorities, there are two powers. If there are two powers, the absolute monotheism that defines Judaism is false. He descended from the vision, proclaiming a sentence that became one of the most notorious heresies in religious history. There are two powers in heaven. In Hebrew, Shtei Reshuyot Bashamayim. The phrase remained recorded in rabbinic manuscripts as the exact expression of the gravest theological error a Jew could commit. Elisha was excommunicated. His memory was erased from the official lists of authorized teachers. The rabbis began calling him simply Acher, which means other in Hebrew. They refused to pronounce his name. But the vision had happened, the theological damage was done, and the sages needed to give an urgent answer to prevent other scholars from following the same path. The answer came through an additional narrative preserved in the same tractate, Haggadah 15a. Here it is important to state that what follows is extra-canonical rabbinic tradition, an interpretive narrative from the Talmud and not a biblical account. The sages built a complementary scene to explain what had truly happened from their point of view in that vision of Elisha. When the angels realized that Elisha was arriving at the conclusion of two powers, they acted to correct the appearance of the vision. Metatron was removed from the throne. Then he was punished, so it would be evident that he was not a parallel God. He received 60 lashes of fire in the presence of the entire heavenly court. 60 lashes. In Hebrew, Shishim Pulsei Denura. Pulses of fire applied upon the person of the Prince of the Face. The punishment had two theological purposes. First, to publicly demonstrate that Metatron was a creature subject to correction, never an absolute creator. Second, to teach Metatron that even possessing an exalted office, he remained subordinate to the unique authority of the Heavenly Father. The image is disturbing. The being who carries the divine name within himself, the Prince of the Face, the Scribe of Heaven, being publicly scourged so that his identity would not be confused with that of the Eternal himself. And there is an even more explosive detail in this rabbinic narrative. The Talmud records that after the punishment, Metatron received authorization to rise and erase Acher's sins from the heavenly record. He had that power. But he heard a voice pronouncing a sentence that sealed the fate of the apostate rabbi. Return, rebellious children, except Acher. All rebellious humanity could be forgiven. Only one man was excluded from the possibility of return. And Metatron was the one who received the order to keep his name eternally blotted out of the book of life. The controversy of the two powers, Shtei Reshuyot, became a doctrinal landmark in Judaism over the following centuries. The sages began treating any hint of binitarianism as an existential threat to monotheistic faith. But the problem is that the doctrine of the two powers did not begin with Elisha. It already existed in Jewish manuscripts before the 1st century of the Christian era. The Dead Sea Scrolls, especially fragments such as 11Q13 Melchizedek, describe a heavenly figure acting as the divine executor of final judgment, receiving titles that traditionally belong to the Eternal. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher contemporary with Christ, described a heavenly entity he called Logos, second God, intermediate manifestation, Son of the Supreme Father. All this terminology circulated among Hellenistic Jews decades before the Gospel of John was written. Targumic literature spoke of the Memra. Wisdom literature spoke of personified wisdom. Mystical literature spoke of Metatron, different names pointing to the same uncomfortable reality. There was an intermediate heavenly figure recognized by Jewish tradition before Christianity was even born, and this figure occupied a space close enough to the divine throne to generate repeated accusations of duplication. The rabbis of the Talmudic period from the 2nd to the 6th century of the Christian era saw this tradition becoming dangerous. The rabbinic reaction was systematic. Tighten monotheistic doctrine, marginalize the mystical texts about Metatron, exclude Enochic literature from the official Hebrew canon, train generations of students to reject any reading that suggested more than one authority in heaven. The figure of Metatron survived only in esoteric circles, medieval Kabbalists, Hasidic mystics, scholars of Merkabah literature. But public Orthodox Judaism progressively erased this being from its everyday theological vocabulary. The question that remained whispering throughout these 2,000 years is simple and devastating. If Metatron existed, if he was recognized by ancient rabbinic tradition, if he occupied a place adjacent to the supreme throne, why did he need to be silenced in such a methodical and careful way by the guardians of the Hebrew faith themselves? The answer requires examining exactly which texts survived, which were excluded, and why editorial decisions made almost 2 millennia ago still determine what is read when one opens a Bible today. The Bible in your hands passed through a brutal editorial process. It was not delivered ready-made from heaven in the form of a bound book. It was compiled, debated, filtered, and defined over centuries by human councils that made specific decisions about what would enter and what would be left outside. This process has a technical name: canonization. In Hebrew, the expression used is Sefarim Hahutzim, the books outside, and Metatron was placed outside. The decision was not accidental. It was calculated. It was documented in the rabbinic manuscripts themselves that still exist today, and it happened in successive waves between the 1st and 6th centuries of the Christian era. The first wave came with the Council of Jamnia around the year 90 of the Christian era. To understand the weight of that meeting, it is necessary to visualize the exact setting in which it happened. Jerusalem was in ruins. The Second Temple had been destroyed by the Roman legions 20 years earlier. The blood of the priests still stained recent memory. The surviving rabbis gathered in a small coastal town, seated around low tables with Torah scrolls stacked around them. The air carried the weight of a religion without temple, without altar, without sacrifice, and it carried something even more serious: the awareness that another religion was being born from that same soil and using the same texts to reach opposite conclusions. Emerging Christianity was spreading across the empire, and it was using Hebrew texts to argue for the divinity of Christ, especially texts about the angel of the presence, about Metatron, about intermediate heavenly figures. Every time a Christian quoted the angel of the Lord from Exodus chapter 23, the rabbis felt the doctrinal ground trembling under their feet. That canonical text was being used against classical Hebrew theology. The solution of Jamnia was defensive: keep the canonical texts, reinterpret them in a way that reduced any opening for binitarian readings, and exclude from the canon all books that develop the doctrine of the elevated angel in detail. First Enoch fell. Second Enoch fell. Sefer Hekalot, which would become Third Enoch, was not even considered for the canon. All Merkabah, mystical literature, was marginalized into esoteric circles. The second wave came between the 3rd and 4th centuries. The Masoretic scribes began working on Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament. These scribes had authority to standardize the vocalization of the text, fix the punctuation, and define correct readings. And they took the opportunity to insert marginal notes called Mazorah, which guided readers to avoid problematic theological interpretations. Every time the angel of the Lord appeared with characteristics that suggested divine identity, the marginal notes subtly directed toward a purely angelic reading without ambiguity. Imagine the care of this operation. A copying scribe, under the weak light of an oil lamp, seated for hours over a parchment, pausing carefully at each sensitive passage to add an interpretive instruction in the margins. Generation after generation, manuscript after manuscript, until the corrected reading became the only possible reading for any instructed Jew. The third wave came with the final redaction of the Babylonian Talmud in the 5th and 6th centuries. The tractates that mentioned Metatron, especially Sanhedrin 38b and Haggiga 15a, were preserved, but surrounded by commentaries that emphasized his absolute subordination to the eternal. The narrative of the 60 lashes seen in previous chapters is exactly part of this strategy. Preserve the tradition but neutralize its theological impact through additional corrective narratives. And there is a detail that shows the level of care in this operation. In some manuscript versions of Tractate Haggiga 15a, the name of Metatron was partially erased from the rabbinic manuscripts themselves. Medieval Jewish scribes debated for centuries whether they should preserve the full reference or abbreviate it. The editorial fragmentation reflects the constant tension between admitting the tradition and containing it. Christian literature, in turn, faced a different path. The early church fathers, especially until the 4th century, openly cited Enochic literature as an authoritative source. Tertullian defended the book of 1st Enoch as inspired. Origen used it in his exegesis. The Epistle of Jude in the canonical New Testament explicitly quotes 1st Enoch chapter 1 verses 9 to 16. But the Western Church ultimately excluded the Enochic books from the Christian canon as well. Only the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved 1st Enoch within its official Bible to this day. The Christian motivation for excluding these texts was different from the Jewish motivation. Christians did not fear binitarianism. They openly affirmed the divinity of Christ, but they feared confusion between Christ and Metatron as parallel figures. They feared that simple believers would worship both as if they were separate realities. The Christian solution was to absorb the functions of Metatron into Christ and silence the original figure. The angel of the Lord in the Old Testament was reinterpreted as the pre-incarnation of the Word. The Prince of the Face was identified as the Son. The Scribe of Heaven was connected to the throne where Christ sits after the resurrection. The result was parallel in both traditions. Metatron as a proper name was erased from the canonical texts, but his functions were preserved, redirected into other theological nomenclatures according to each tradition. There is a paradox that concludes this editorial process. The attempt to eliminate Metatron from the scriptures had a reverse effect in religious history. The mystical texts that survived in restricted circles gained the aura of forbidden revelation. Medieval Kabbalah, especially the Zohar of the 13th century, placed Metatron back at the center of Jewish mystical speculation. What the Talmudic rabbis tried to contain for more than 1,000 years returned with doubled force precisely because it had been censored. The Hasidic movements of the 18th century rehabilitated Merkaba literature. Modern scholars like Gershom Scholem in the 20th century brought these texts back into the central academic debate. Today, any serious researcher of comparative theology knows the tradition of Metatron. Universities such as the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Princeton, and Harvard publish detailed studies on Merkaba literature every year. What was esoteric became public academic domain. But the Bible bought in the bookstore has not been updated. It continues to deliver the angel of the Lord without a proper name. It continues to remain silent about Enoch transformed into a heavenly entity. It continues calling the Scribe of Heaven only the one who writes without identifying him. The editorial decision made between the 1st and 6th centuries of the Christian era still dictates what is read today. The filters applied almost 2,000 years ago remain active. The name remains outside. And the most disturbing question of this entire investigation up to this point arises. If Christian tradition absorbed the functions of Metatron and redirected them toward Christ, are we facing two separate figures, or distinct manifestations of the same reality through different ages of progressive revelation? The answer to this question involves textual parallels between the Old Testament, the New Testament, and Hebrew mystical literature that coincide at points far too exact to be coincidence. And a single declaration spoken by Christ himself in the Gospels may be the key that connects everything investigated up to this point. The parallels keep accumulating in the sacred text, and each new layer makes coincidence less sustainable. Jewish mystical literature says that Metatron carries the name of the Eternal within himself. The Gospel of John, chapter 17, verse 11, records Christ praying to the Father with the phrase, "Holy Father, keep through thine own name those whom thou hast given me." Through thine own name, the divine name applied both to the Son and to those who belong to the Son. Rabbinic tradition calls Metatron Yahweh Hakatan, the lesser Yahweh. The Gospel of John chapter 1 verse 1 declares that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was God. Not another God. The same divine reality manifested in distinct form. Sefer Hekalot describes Metatron seated on the second throne. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 26 verse 64 records Christ before the Sanhedrin answering the question about his messianic identity. "Ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Sitting at the right hand, positioned in a place adjacent to the supreme throne, exactly like Metatron in the mystical description. Not as a standing servant, but as the bearer of shared authority. The sentence of Christ caused such scandal in the Jewish court that the high priest tore his own garments and formally accused him of blasphemy. Why? Because any rabbi of the 1st century immediately recognized what this declaration was claiming. The position of the Prince of the Face, the place reserved for a specific figure in Hebrew mystical tradition. Christ was publicly assuming the office that the rabbis kept silent in esoteric circles. Daniel chapter 7 verse 13 describes a Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven and approaching the Ancient of Days, receiving dominion, glory, and kingdom. The title Son of Man was the one Christ used most often for himself in the Gospels. It appears 82 times in the New Testament. He did not choose abstract titles. He did not say Messiah directly until the final moments. He did not say Son of God in every context, but he repeated without ceasing the expression Son of Man, which pointed directly to Daniel 7. Part of medieval Jewish mystical tradition identified the Son of Man in Daniel with Metatron. Christ identified the Son of Man with himself. The two readings overlap in the same verse. John chapter 10 verse 30 records the most explosive declaration of Christ's ministry. "I and the Father are one." The Jews around him immediately picked up stones, not to attack some generic blasphemy, to execute a specific sentence. In the following verse, they declare that the stoning is not for any good work, but for blasphemy, because a man makes himself God. "Being a man, thou makest thyself God." That is the literal accusation, and it is exactly the same accusation that 2nd century rabbis made against Elisha ben Abuya when he proclaimed two powers in heaven after his vision of Metatron. The structure is identical. A man recognizing an elevated heavenly figure who carries total divine authority. The difference is that Christ personally identified himself as that figure, and Elisha only beheld it in ecstasy. Margaret Barker, a British Methodist theologian, dedicated decades of research to these parallels. Her central thesis is that First Temple Judaism, before the Deuteronomistic reform of King Josiah in the 7th century before Christ, maintained an explicitly binitarian theology. Father and Son, eternal in his manifested reflection. Josiah's reform attempted to erase this structure, but remnants of it survived in Jewish mystical texts under the name METATRON. Daniel Boyarin, professor at Berkeley and specialist in Talmud and New Testament, argued that the doctrine of the two powers in heaven was not a Christian creation. It was an ancient Jewish tradition that Christianity inherited and developed. The first Christians did not invent the divinity of Christ. They identified Christ with a heavenly figure that Second Temple Judaism already recognized. Alan Siegel, the late professor at Barnard, wrote the definitive study on the theme with the book Two Powers in Heaven, originally published in 1977. Siegel demonstrated through rigorous textual analysis that the controversy of the two powers precedes Christianity, anticipates Christianity, and was suppressed by the rabbis precisely because Christians were using it to ground their Christology. Academic research over the last 50 years has progressively converged on this point. The figure Christianity calls Christ finds direct parallels in a Hebrew tradition that names this being in other forms. Memra in the Targumim, personified wisdom in the wisdom books, Logos in Philo of Alexandria, Metatron in rabbinic mystical literature. All these names point to a common reality, an intermediate heavenly manifestation authorized to bear divine authority, speak in the name of the Supreme Father, be seen by human eyes without destroying them, sit upon a throne adjacent to the central throne, and mediate the relationship between the invisible and humanity. Christ entered this already existing conceptual structure and personally fulfilled it. He did not create a new office. He occupied an office that Hebrew mystical tradition had recognized since before the Exodus, perhaps since before the foundation of the world. Hebrews chapter 1 verses 1 and 2 summarizes this transition. God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son, whom he hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. In former times, in many ways, different names, different manifestations, the Memra, the angel of the face, the Yahweh HaKatan. In these last days by the Son, one single full manifestation identified by a proper name, incarnate in human form, living among men, dying on a cross, rising on the third day, seated again upon the throne that belonged to him. Before creation, the question is not whether Metatron is Christ. The question is whether ancient Hebrew tradition was seeing, in shadows and partial names, the same reality that the gospel reveals in fullness and in concrete person. And here is the point where this entire investigation stops. Every piece examined in the previous chapters, but every fragment of mystical tradition, every rabbinic controversy, every editorial decision of the canon, every academic parallel, all point to the same inescapable conclusion. There existed from the beginning of the scriptures a figure who cannot be explained merely as an angel. There existed from the beginning a being who simultaneously occupied the place of servant and the place of sovereign. There existed, hidden on every page of the Old Testament, the exact shadow of the one who would come to manifest himself in concrete person in the New Testament. And that concrete person has a name known by every mouth in every place, in every tongue. A name that makes the heavens bow and the hells tremble. The name before which every knee shall bow. That name is Jesus. And it is the same name the ancients covered with shadows called Memra, angel of the face, Yahweh HaKatan, Metatron. Until next time.